Welcome back to America's Fractured Politics. The November 12 release of some of the Jeffrey Epstein emails is a watershed moment. For years, the Epstein case has lurked, replete with partial truths, incriminating associations, and the extraordinary question of how vast networks of political, financial, and social influence could be implicated in systemic exploitation and yet avoid the full weight of justice. These newly unveiled emails do more than resurrect that scandal. They force the country to confront its enduring complicity and ignoring what was in plain sight. And among those drawn back into the light is Donald Trump, whose long uneasy connection to Epstein has once again become a subject of national fascination, anger, and frustration. From the first evening that news outlets began publishing damning excerpts, the reaction was immediate. The correspondence between Epstein and a cavalcade of the elite painted a portrait of privilege, operating according to its own moral code. But among the hundreds of names weaving through the emails, corporate magnates, media power breakers, heads of state, the recurring appearance of Trump's name, often in casual but unmistakably personal context, laden with singular weight. It wasn't merely that his name appeared, it was how, when, and in what proximity to both his business rise and his political ascent. The public has long been familiar with the broad outline of Trump's relationship with Epstein. Both were celebrities in Palm Beach in the 1990s. Trump had famously told reporters decades ago that Epstein was a terrific guy who liked women on the younger side, a remark that aged into something far more damning once Epstein's predations became undeniable. When Epstein was first arrested in 2006, Trump attempted to downplay their connection, claiming that they had a falling out and that he had banned Epstein from Mar-a-Lago. Over time, this story hardened into political scripture within Trump world. That his association with Epstein was short, inconsequential, and long behind him. But the emails tell a different, murkier story, one in which Epstein continued to reference Trump and his inner circle as late as 2019, suggesting attempts to reconnect, trade introductions, or exchange favors. Some messages appear to have been from intermediaries, figures in modeling, finance, and political fundraising circles, discussing potential joint ventures or acknowledgement of shared acquaintances. These emails alone establish a pattern of contact that shatters the narrative Trump had carefully constructed. To understand why this matters, one has to appreciate how central the mythology of separation has been to Trump's survival. For every scandal that dogged his career, fraud cases, hush payments, foreign entanglements, and classified documents, he relied on the power of distance. They did it, not me. I didn't know. That was years ago. This rhetorical pattern is his shield, a strategy of plausible ignorance fortified by repetition. But when the distance collapses, when the paper trail shows not absence but familiarity, that shield begins to crack. Politically, this revelation hits Trump at a critical and uniquely vulnerable moment. The 2026 midterms are on the horizon. His influence over the Republican Party remains immense but no longer unquestioned. The release of the Epstein emails introduced a different kind of peril, one that penetrates the moral and psychological foundation of his supporters' loyalty. It's not about policy or ideology. It's about character, temptation, and guilt by association. Epstein's name, even now, is radioactive. He represents not just personal criminality, but systemic rot, an ecosystem of enablers, from banks to bureaucrats to celebrities, who protected him because he was one of them. Trump, who built his populist power on the rhetoric of betrayal by elites, now confronts a reality where those same elites were his dinner companions, fellow partygoers, and partners in excess. This undercuts his mythology as a man of the people and recasts him as what he always claimed to fight, the embodiment of privilege shielded from consequence. For Trump's base, parsing that contradiction will not be easy. Many will reject the emails outright, embracing conspiracy narratives that they were manipulated or fabricated by the deep state or weaponized by hostile media. Trump's machinery has already leaned into that message, claiming that the entire release is a politically timed assault meant to destroy his credibility before the next election cycle. But unlike previous scandals, which could be spun as witch hunts aimed at silencing him, the Epstein connection challenges not just his behavior, but his entire identity as an avenger of corruption. The timing is critical. Trump's legal team is already stretched thin to grasp the full magnitude of this moment. One must situate it in a broader context. America's recurring confrontation with its own hierarchy of impunity. Epstein's story, his access, his immunity, his connections to nearly every sector of influence, embodied the structural corruption that populist leaders claim to oppose, but often perpetuate. Trump's entanglement in that web is more than a personal scandal. It's a symbol of national exhaustion, the cyclical recognition that power protects itself until confronted by undeniable evidence. And when that confrontation occurs, it is not justice that triumphs, but public fatigue. In the immediate aftermath of the email release, social media erupted with familiar polarization. Trump supporters dismissed it as another hoax. His opponents proclaimed it the final proof of hypocrisy they had long alleged. But behind the noise was something quieter, more introspective. A growing sense among average Americans that the Epstein saga, long treated as exceptional, may simply be a visible symptom of a deeper decay and how this country polices the intersection of wealth, sex, and politics. Journalists have begun drawing connections between Epstein's correspondence networks and policy influence, particularly in the overlapping circles of finance and government during the early 1990s through the 2000s. If those connections widened to reveal even tangential exchanges involving Trump or his associates, the implications could reach into questions of campaign fundraising, foreign donation channels, and potential quid pro quo arrangements. Right now, the major issue is Trump's sexual behavior. Epstein made it clear himself in his emails that this was a case of Trump knowing that the girls existed, that Trump was with the girl for 4 hours. All of this suggests that Trump is lying. But suddenly, what began as a story about private misconduct becomes one about governance, secrecy, and national vulnerability. For Trump himself, the test will come not in the revelation, but in the reaction. His instinct, honed over decades in media's combat, will be to dominate the narrative, not to hide from it. Expect him to continue framing the emails as fake or as a diversion from what he'll call real crimes committed by the establishment. He's predictably blamed the Democrats for their fake news. Every demagogue eventually faces the moment when spectacle stops working, when the crowd's applause becomes uneasy, when his performative rage begins to sound rehearsed. The Epstein emails could mark that turning point, not because they reveal something shocking, but because they confirm what many have always suspected, that the populist warrior who once promised to drain the swamp was never outside it. The ripple effects will not stop with Trump. The media, hungry for redemption after years of chasing the Epstein story without closure, now dives headlong into every thread of connection. What emerges is a spectacle of synchronized outrage, a theater of condemnation that often conceals the systemic nature of the problem. Indeed, the Epstein saga has always been about more than one predator or one set of victims. It is about power itself, how it concentrates, how it protects itself, and how it adapts to exposure. Trump's entanglement with that network serves as a prism through which to understand America's recurring inability to confront elite wrongdoing. The same forces that enabled Epstein, money, connections, legal leniency, silence, are the ones that continue to shape Trump's resilience. The details differ, but the architecture of impunity remains constant. The emotional toll of this story cannot be overlooked. For the survivors of Epstein's abuse, these emails reopen wounds. They show in cold bureaucratic text how their pain coexisted with casual social chatter among the powerful. For the American public, the documents revive a broader disillusionment, a sense that accountability is selective, that the law bends for some but not for others. Trump's involvement amplifies that cynicism because he represents the ultimate inversion of moral consequence, a man who turns every accusation into a rallying cry, every disgrace into a headline. Still, there are indications that this scandal could reach deeper than previous ones. Unlike abstract political controversies, the Epstein emails evoke tangible human suffering. They cannot be easily reframed as partisan warfare because they exist in the moral register, where questions of guilt, empathy, and conscience are harder to dismiss. And in this moral language, Trump is on unfamiliar ground. His strength lies in division, not redemption. Yet the voters who might forgive corruption in the name of power may find this particular association in the outrageous activities they implicated, impossible to compartmentalize. His polls begin to register early reactions. Signs of erosion are visible. Independent voters, especially suburban women whom Trump struggled to win back in 2024, show a marked decline in favorability. Among younger Republicans, fatigue is evident, not necessarily from the scandal itself, but from the endless cycle of crisis that defines his public life. For moderates wary of Democratic dominance but exhausted by Trump's chaos, this email release may finally tilt their patience into disaffection. Still, to assume this marks Trump's political death would be naive. His endurance is always dependent on something beyond logic, a deep, almost mythic sense of grievance that transcends evidence. He has built a psychological fortress out of victimhood, convincing millions that attacks on him are attacks on them. Inside that framework, truth becomes elastic. Documents, witnesses, even photographs can be dismissed as part of the grand plot to silence the one man brave enough to expose corruption. Whether this contract can withstand the moral gravity of Epstein's crimes, however, remains to be seen. Meanwhile, within the Republican Party, divisions are sharpening. Establishment figures who tolerated Trump's dominance for fear of alienating his base now face a dilemma: double down on defense or begin the slow process of disengagement. Some party strategists already quietly argue that the Epstein release gives them a politically convenient excuse to pivot away from Trump before 2026, an opportunity to reclaim moral ground without directly confronting his voters. Others warn that abandoning him now could fracture the party irreparably. Democrats, for their part, tread carefully. Their instinct will be to attack, but history warns of the boomerang effect. Overreach that turns Trump into the underdog again. Instead, some Democratic lawmakers hinted a bipartisan inquiry into Epstein's network, signaling an appetite for a broader reckoning that transcends partisan advantage. If done properly, such an inquiry could reframe the issue as a universal moral crisis rather than another weapon in America's endless culture war. The effort to force the release of the Justice Department files is bipartisan, with the likelihood that more Republicans will vote for release than Democrats. What remains unavoidable is the symbolism. The Epstein emails are not just correspondence. They are mirrors held up to an age of complicity. Every name on those pages carries a legacy of indulgence, denial, or silence. For Trump, the mirror reflects a central contradiction: a man who weaponized the outrage of ordinary Americans while moving comfortably among the very elites whose depravity he condemned. As this saga unfolds, public reaction will likely evolve along predictable lines: initial shock, partisan interpretation, fatigue, and finally resignation. But this time something feels different. Perhaps it is because the evidence is textual and unambiguous and involves sexual misbehavior. Perhaps it is because Epstein's crimes are universally revolting, crossing ideological boundaries. Or perhaps it is because Americans have grown weary of the endless cycle of revelations that yield no reckoning. The deeper story here is not about Trump per se, but what his entanglement reveals about America's moral memory. Each decade brings its crisis of elite abuse, from Watergate to Enron to Harvey Weinstein to Jeffrey Epstein. And each time, the promise of reform gives way to the amnesia of convenience. Trump's era was supposed to be the reaction against that pattern, yet in the end, his name returns to the same ledger of corrupt and untouchable. What may emerge from this scandal, if anything constructive can, is a clearer understanding of how easily phony populism becomes the disguise of privilege. Trump's appeal was never populist in practice. It was theatrical. It offered the spectacle of rebellion without the substance of accountability. The Epstein emails puncture that illusion. They remind the public that the populist who claims to fight the elites often simply wishes to replace them. In the weeks ahead, as more correspondence is analyzed, the gravity of this release will deepen. Some emails contain personal reflections in Epstein's own words about his relationships with politicians and public figures, including Trump, describing patterns of influence and protection. These accounts withstand scrutiny. They could force uncomfortable conversations about campaign financing, law enforcement, negligence, and institutional complicity, stretching across multiple administrations, notwithstanding the sexual aspect. No matter how the legal system proceeds, the public reckoning has already begun. Trump characteristically will frame himself as a martyr rather than participant. He will continue to deflect questions, attack the press, and portray the entire scandal as a coordinated assault on his movement. Whether that defense holds will depend less on evidence than on endurance, on whether fatigue, once again, overwhelms outrage. And if history is any guide, fatigue usually wins. Yet there's also a quiet countercurrent emerging. Survivors advocacy groups are using the renewed spotlight to demand full transparency, not just from the Trump circle, but from every institution that shielded Epstein. They argue that the emails must not be reduced to political ammunition, but treated as evidence of systemic failure. Their voices carry moral authority that politics cannot easily neutralize. If that momentum continues, it could push the country toward a broader reckoning with how wealth and power warp justice. In the end, Donald Trump may deflect, deny, and delay, but the documents exist. Each email is a thread in a tapestry that stretches beyond individual scandal into the architecture of American privilege. The real question is whether the country will choose to look at it, or as it has so many times before, avert its eyes in exhaustion and pretend the cycle is broken when it has only begun again. Over the coming months, there will be hearings, interviews, counter-investigations, and the usual parade of partisan theater. But behind all of that drama remains a simple truth. The Epstein emails have redrawn the line between perception and proof. They have transformed whispers into text, speculation into documentation, and in that transformation lies a reckoning, not just for Donald Trump, but for every citizen who must decide whether power should ever again mean protection. When future historians examine this moment, they may not focus on the sensational details of the emails or the day-to-day media frenzy. They may see the gradual erosion of the national willingness to believe that corruption is exceptional rather than endemic, and that more than any court ruling or political fallout may be the legacy of these emails. Trump's fate remains uncertain. He has an uncanny ability to bend crises into narratives of endurance. But moral gravity eventually asserts itself. The Epstein emails strip away the noise and leave only proximity and choice. Who stayed close to the darkness, who profited from it, and who helped it hide. In that sense, this scandal is not about endings, but about exposure. The final word, if such a thing exists in the world of Trump and Epstein, belongs not to prosecutors or pundits, but to the citizens who decide what kind of country they want to inhabit. One that forgives its powerful too easily, or one that finally insists that proximity to power should not mean freedom from consequence. This has been America's Fractured Politics. Continue the fight. Demand justice. Demand the truth. Goodbye until next episode.